Clara Wren sat at the edge of the bed, the silver spoon in her hand trembling just slightly. She steadied it before guiding it toward Silas Drayton's lips. The mixture was warm, a blend of broth and ground vegetables, its scent mingling with the faint perfume of lilies arranged neatly on the nightstand. The light from the half-drawn curtains bathed them both in a soft golden haze, catching the streaks of silver in her hair. Her eyes were tired, not from a single sleepless night, but from years of quiet endurance. 10 years of tending to the man she once shared moonlit dances with. 10 years of holding his hand while he lay so still that she counted every breath as a blessing. Yet even now her fingers brushed his as though touching something fragile and precious. "Have you ever loved someone so deeply," she murmured softly, almost to herself, "that you'd give up years of your life just to keep them alive?" Silas looked at her with half-lidded eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been my strength, Clara." The words made her throat tighten. She had built her days around this, the measured meals, the gentle massages to ease his pain, the endless readings of his favorite stories. If you believe trust is the foundation of love, pause this story for just a moment, tap that like button, share it with someone who cherishes loyalty, and subscribe so you don't miss the kind of stories that stay with you long after they're told. Her gaze wandered to the photograph on the wall. In it, they were younger, laughing, the children barely toddlers in their arms. She could still remember the night it was taken. A warm evening, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the kitchen, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist as their daughter tried to grab at his tie. Those were days when the air seemed lighter, when their kisses lingered, when the heat of his breath at her neck sent a tremor through her. Now she spoon-fed him with the same tenderness she once reserved for their most intimate moments, unaware that the love she had fought to keep alive was about to be tested in a way she could never have imagined. From the hallway came the sound of small footsteps. Their son Daniel peeked in first, his dark hair tousled from play. "Is Daddy eating better today?" he asked, hope lighting up his young face. Behind him, little Elise clutched a worn teddy bear, her wide eyes fixed on the bed. Clara smiled softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "He's trying, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice gentle. She didn't want them to see the weariness in her bones. To them, their father was a hero resting until the day he'd rise and scoop them up in his arms again. Daniel stepped forward, placing a small, clumsy kiss on his father's forehead. "When you're better, can we go to the beach again?" The question caught Clara in the chest. Silas's lips curved faintly, almost as if the thought pleased him, or perhaps it was something else entirely that stirred behind his eyes. As the children skipped away toward the kitchen, giggling over some private joke, Clara remained by the bed. She studied his face, familiar yet changed, tracing the faint lines at the corners of his mouth, the way his gaze sometimes drifted when she spoke to him. She told herself it was the illness, that 10 years of weakness could change a man's expressions. Still, a whisper of unease pressed at the edge of her mind. Her hand rested over his, the way it had countless times before, remembering nights when that same hand had explored her skin with a tenderness that left her breathless. There had been evenings when they'd curled together beneath the quilt, his voice low and warm in her ear, speaking words only meant for her. That closeness had once been their language, wordless yet completely understood. Now she clung to the remnants of it. She leaned down, pressing her lips to his temple. "We'll get through this," she whispered. He closed his eyes as if in agreement, but something in the set of his jaw made her chest tighten. If you've ever held on to someone because you believed your love could carry them through anything, let me know in the comments, because for Clara, that belief was everything, and soon she would learn just how fragile that belief could be. Clara Wren had never cared much for the kind of formal events that required sparkling gowns and polite small talk. She had only agreed to attend because her friend insisted it would do her good to be around people. That night she wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck. She stood off to the side, laughing at something her friend whispered. The sound wasn't loud, but it was genuine, the sort of laughter that came from the heart and seemed to warm the air around her. It was in that moment Silas Drayton saw her. Across the room, he was mid-conversation with a group of associates, but his attention drifted entirely. She wasn't the most elaborately dressed woman there, but there was something about her, a light in her eyes and ease in her posture that held him. When they were introduced later that evening, their handshake lingered just a second longer than necessary. "Clara Wren," he repeated, as though committing the name to memory. From that night on, Silas found excuses to see her again. The first was an invitation for coffee, not at a high-end venue, but at a cozy cafe where the tables were slightly wobbly and the smell of fresh pastries filled the air. They sat by the window, watching the street outside as autumn leaves drifted down. She told him about her work with a local youth program, and he listened intently, his chin resting lightly in his hand. Their conversations became the kind you didn't want to end. There were walks through quiet streets carpeted in gold and crimson leaves, moments where their fingers brushed and the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken promises. One evening they wandered to the edge of a park where an old maple tree stood, its branches stretching wide. They paused beneath it, the lamplight filtering through its leaves. Silas reached for her hand, and in that soft, unhurried moment, he kissed her. It was the kind of kiss that asked no questions and needed no answers, a beginning they both felt in their bones. The weeks that followed were a blur of small, meaningful gestures. Silas leaving folded notes in the pockets of her coat, words of encouragement, silly sketches, little reminders of how he felt. Clara surprising him with his favorite chocolate truffles after a long day. They were learning each other's rhythms, each quirk and each joy. The seasons turned, and with each passing month, Clara and Silas grew more certain that their lives belonged together. Less than 2 years after their first meeting, Silas proposed in the quietest way possible. Over a dinner he cooked himself, in his small apartment kitchen. He knelt with a simple ring, his voice steady, but his eyes searching hers for that one word he longed to hear. She said it without hesitation. Their wedding was modest by choice. Surrounded by family and close friends, they exchanged vows in a sunlit hall with soft music playing in the background. There was no excess, no performance, just a deep sense of sincerity in every glance and every promise. As they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, Clara felt an unshakable certainty. This was the man she would grow old with. The early years were filled with moments that stitched them even closer. Sunday mornings meant breakfast in bed, with Clara curled into the crook of his arm as he read aloud from the paper. Evenings often ended with them cooking side by side, stealing playful touches as pots simmered on the stove. When their son Daniel arrived, Silas cried quietly in the delivery room, holding the newborn with an awe that softened every line of his face. 2 years later came Elise, whose tiny fingers wrapped instinctively around his. Parenthood brought a different kind of intimacy, one built on shared exhaustion, whispered reassurances in the dark, and a fierce devotion to the little family they had created. During these years, Silas's career began to ascend rapidly. His talent for strategy and his ability to connect with people earned him a position as CEO of a well-established company. The money that followed changed their lifestyle, but not, at first, their values. Clara insisted on keeping life as normal as possible for the children, still shopping at the same local market, still volunteering at the youth program where she had worked before. Even as his schedule filled with meetings and business trips, Silas made a point to leave her notes. Folded squares of paper slipped into her handbag or tucked beneath her pillow. "Thinking of you," one might say, or "dinner under the stars soon." These small acts made the wealth feel irrelevant, a backdrop rather than the focus. They were, to all who knew them, the kind of couple that others quietly admired, not for grand gestures, but for the way they seemed to choose each other every day. If you've ever believed in fairy tale love, comment below with a heart, because Clara thought hers was one. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. Clara was at home, folding Elise's laundry, when Silas's assistant's voice broke through the hum of the dryer. "Clara, it's Silas." He collapsed in the office. "The ambulance is on the way." By the time she reached the hospital, he was pale and disoriented, his gaze flickering as if he were fighting to stay awake. A doctor met her in the hallway, speaking in careful tones about exhaustion, a possible underlying condition, and the need for extended rest. "It won't be a matter of weeks," the doctor explained. "He'll need months, perhaps years. His body must be given every chance to recover." The words felt like ice settling into her chest, but she nodded. There was no question in her mind. She would care for him. That night, she sat by his bed, holding his hand as monitors beeped steadily around them. When he was discharged weeks later, their bedroom transformed into a space for healing. She rearranged furniture to make room for medical equipment, learned how to monitor his vitals, and mastered the art of preparing nutrient-rich meals that wouldn't upset his weakened system. Clara left her part-time work at the youth program without hesitation. Her days became a careful rhythm. Mornings spent spoon-feeding him breakfast, afternoons managing medications, evenings massaging his hands when pain gripped them. At night she read to him, her voice a quiet anchor in the stillness. Sometimes he would drift off mid-sentence, but she kept reading anyway, convinced that her words might reach him somewhere beyond sleep. Through it all, there was Iris Morel, the maid who had worked for them for nearly 2 years. She moved quietly through the house, changing linens, keeping the place in order, and offering to help with his care whenever Clara needed a moment to herself. Iris was polite, her voice calm, her presence steady. Clara was grateful at first, though she noticed now and then that Iris lingered just a little longer in the room after her tasks were done. Silas often slept through these visits, or so Clara thought. She told herself it was nothing, just attentiveness from someone who respected her employer. After all, this was her husband, her life's partner. Trust was the ground she stood on. Still, there were moments when Clara returned from the kitchen to find Iris adjusting his blanket, her eyes meeting Clara's with a polite but unreadable expression. And though she brushed it aside, a faint unease began to settle in the corners of her mind. Winter brought quiet mornings where the world outside seemed to move slower than the ticking clock in their bedroom. Clara would wake before dawn, slipping from under the covers so as not to disturb him. She'd make tea, then return to sit by his side, her fingers brushing against his as she checked his pulse. "Do you remember when we used to walk by the harbor at sunrise?" she asked one morning, her voice low. He gave a faint nod, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. It was enough to make her heart ache with both joy and longing. There were good days when he had the strength to speak more, when he asked about the children or smiled at one of Elise's drawings taped to the wardrobe. Those were the days Clara felt her hopes swell. But there were also the quiet days, when he seemed to drift somewhere far away, his eyes fixed on the window, as if the world outside was calling to him. Every evening, she massaged his hands and shoulders, her touch slow and deliberate, easing the stiffness that came from too much time in bed. The intimacy wasn't the same as before, but it was still theirs, the kind of closeness built on care, patience, and devotion. She would lean close, her forehead brushing his, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "We're in this together," she would whisper. Iris's presence remained steady. She brought in fresh flowers for the room, changed the sheets twice a week, and kept his clothes neatly folded. Clara noticed she often came in without being asked, especially when Clara was tending to something in the kitchen or helping the children with homework. She told herself it was kindness. After all, the work was demanding, and an extra pair of hands was useful. Yet there were moments that made her pause. Once returning from taking out the trash, she found the bedroom door closed. When she stepped inside, Iris was sitting on the edge of the bed, speaking softly to Silas. They both looked up quickly. Iris excused herself with a quiet smile, carrying an empty vase out of the room. Clara's chest tightened, but she forced a smile in return. She pushed the thought away. There was no space in her mind for suspicion, not when her days were measured in careful doses of medicine, in the soft sound of her husband's breathing at night, in the hope that each morning might bring him closer to recovery. It had been one of those Decembers where the cold seemed to wrap itself around the whole city, the kind that made every step outside feel like a rush back toward warmth. Clara had been in the kitchen, pulling trays of spiced cookies from the oven, when she heard music drifting from the living room. Not just any music, a slow, lilting melody that had been theirs since the early days. When she stepped through the doorway, she froze. Silas had moved the furniture to the sides, creating a wide open space. Strands of warm lights were strung from corner to corner, casting a gentle glow over the polished wood floor. In the center, he stood in a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his eyes fixed on her with that familiar, almost boyish smile. "Dance with me," he said, extending his hand. She laughed softly, setting down the plate in her hands, and walked toward him. As soon as her palm touched his, he pulled her close, their bodies finding a rhythm that needed no practice. His other hand rested lightly at her waist, fingers splayed against the fabric of her dress. She could smell the faint hint of pine from the wreath on the wall, and the rich, smoky scent of the fire crackling in the hearth. Neither of them spoke for a while. The world outside could have disappeared, and it wouldn't have mattered. He brushed a strand of hair away from her face, his thumb grazing her cheek in a way that made her feel as though every year, every memory they'd shared, was folded into that single touch. Her head came to rest against his chest, and she could hear the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. He swayed with her, slow and deliberate, letting the music guide them through a space they both knew by heart. A soft light played along his jawline, and when she looked up, his gaze held hers with an intensity that both calmed and stirred her. The song slowed to its final notes, but neither of them moved to break the embrace. Silas pressed his lips to her forehead, lingering there as if to seal the moment. Clara felt the warmth of his breath at her temple, the reassuring weight of his arms holding her as though she were the only thing keeping him steady. He reached past her to switch off the music, but kept one hand on her back, guiding her gently toward the couch. There, a thick quilt was draped over the armrest. Without a word, he pulled it around them both, settling into the cushion so she could curl against him. The firelight flickered over their faces, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. Clara rested her head on his chest, listening to the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. His fingertips traced small circles along her shoulder, sending a familiar shiver down her spine. It was the kind of closeness that didn't require conversation, the quiet language they had spoken since the beginning, built on trust, touch, and the knowledge of being wholly seen. They stayed like that for a long time, the quilt cocooning them from the chill beyond the walls. Outside, flakes drifted under the glow of the street lamps, but inside, time seemed to stretch. Silas kissed the top of her head, and she responded by tightening her arms around him, as if holding him there could make this warmth last forever. Eventually, she felt his body relax fully beneath her, their breathing falling into perfect sync. Her eyes closed, but her mind stayed awake just long enough to memorize the way his heartbeat sounded in that moment, steady, strong, and entirely hers. For Clara, it was more than just a dance on a cold December night. It was a reminder of why she had chosen him, of every reason she would one day fight to keep him. She didn't know then that memories like this would become her refuge and her undoing. The weeks after Christmas brought a shift Clara couldn't quite name. Silas was still soft-spoken, still thanked her for the smallest kindnesses, but there was a faint difference in the way he looked at her, as though his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. She noticed it first during their evening routines. Before, he would watch her as she read aloud, his eyes following every line of her face, even if fatigue pulled at him. Now, there were nights when his gaze seemed to drift toward the window, or down to his hands, as if the sound of her voice no longer anchored him the way it once had. "It's just the illness," she told herself, turning the page. "He's tired. You're tired." Iris continued her steady work around the house, but Clara began to feel that her presence in the bedroom stretched just a little too long. Sometimes she would arrive to change the linens and stay to fluff pillows, straighten the nightstand, or fold the same blanket twice. She moved quietly, but Clara caught glimpses of her speaking to Silas in low tones while smoothing the sheet over his legs. When Clara entered during one such moment, Silas's voice trailed off, and Iris excused herself quickly. Clara thought nothing of it at first. After all, privacy was rare in their busy household, and perhaps he'd simply been telling Iris what chores were most urgent. Still, the image stayed in her mind longer than she expected. There were small absences, too. Once, she came upstairs after settling the children to find the bed empty. She heard faint conversation from the adjoining study and discovered Silas there with Iris, who was adjusting a lamp on his desk. He claimed he'd needed a change of scenery. Clara nodded, carrying a tray of tea back to the bedroom, her steps slower than usual. The distance showed itself in other ways, not coldness exactly, but an absence of the easy warmth that had once been there. When she took his hand now, he would hold it loosely before letting it slip away. When she leaned in to kiss his temple, he sometimes turned his head slightly, offering only a brief contact before murmuring that he was tired. But for every flicker of doubt, there was a moment that kept her tethered to hope, a half-smile when the children bounded into the room, a soft squeeze of her fingers when she adjusted his pillow, a murmured thank you after she massaged his shoulders. In her heart, Clara clung to the belief that his distance was nothing more than the toll of his illness, that once his strength returned, so would their closeness. She pushed away the whisper of unease, telling herself she had no reason to question the man who had once made her feel cherished beyond measure. Would you confront a suspicion, or would you protect the love you think you have? Tell me in the comments. Clara hadn't planned to be home this early. The party favors were still rattling in a paper bag on the passenger seat, the ribbon on Elise's wrist coming loose, Daniel dozing with a frosting smear at the corner of his mouth. She carried the sleepy pair into the house one by one, their warm weight a comfort she could feel in her arms. Mrs. Green from next door was waiting on the porch, just as Clara had asked. "I'll tuck them in," Mrs. Green whispered, taking Daniel's hand. "Go check on him. I'll handle these two." "Thank you," Clara said, squeezing her neighbor's fingers. She moved to the kitchen, setting down a small container of pudding she'd brought for Silas, the kind he could swallow without effort. She found a clean spoon, her mind already picturing his soft thanks, the quiet way his lips would lift when he saw her. As she stepped into the hallway, a sound floated down from upstairs. Muffled laughter, two voices low and close. Her name wasn't spoken, yet something about the tone made her stop mid-step. The heater hummed, steady as a lullaby. A floorboard gave under her weight with a soft creak. She stood still listening. The voices blended again, a quick hush, then another small sound that might have been a breath caught at the throat. Clara told herself it could be the television. It could be a friend of Silas's dropping by to check on him. It could be Iris bringing up fresh linens and telling a gentle joke to keep his spirits up. He needed kindness. He needed people. But the sound of that quiet laughter didn't feel like kindness. It felt private. She held the spoon tighter than she meant to. The metal pressed a small crescent into her palm. Step by step she climbed. The banister felt cool beneath her hand. With every rise of her foot, the hum of the heater seemed louder, almost covering the barely there murmur of voices. She paused at the landing, listening again. The laughter had stopped. Silence spread in a thin layer over the hallway, so still that the small clock on the wall sounded like a pulse. Her bedroom door was almost closed, not shut, but near enough. She pushed it gently with her fingertips, the edge brushing her knuckle as it swung inward. Silas was standing. He wasn't weak. He wasn't struggling for balance. He was upright, steady on both feet, the color back in his face, and his hands were on Iris's waist. For a beat, no one moved. Iris's eyes widened, mouth parting in a quiet gasp. Silas's expression changed in an instant, from the surprise of being discovered to something like apology, then to nothing at all, as if he were trying to erase his own face. The spoon slipped from Clara's fingers. It struck the hardwood with a small, bright sound and rolled in a widening circle before coming to rest. Clara's breath caught, but no sound came out. The air in the room felt different, warmer, heavier, as though it had been holding a secret all on its own. Silas stepped back first, his hands leaving Iris's waist as if the contact had suddenly burned him. "Clara," he began, but the single word faltered. Iris took a small step away, her gaze flicking to the floor. She stopped herself, the excuse dying in the air. Her hands moved to smooth the hem of her blouse, a restless motion that only made Clara's chest tighten. Clara didn't move forward. Her feet felt anchored to the spot, her fingers curling slightly at her sides where moments ago they had been wrapped around a spoon meant for him. "How long?" Her voice was low, steady, though her heart was pounding hard enough to feel in her throat. Silas's jaw worked, but no answer came. He glanced at Iris, who kept her eyes down, then back to Clara. "It's not what it looks like," she cut in, the words sharper than she intended. "You're standing here, with her. On your feet," her eyes flicked down his frame to the strength in his posture, the way he held himself. So unlike the fragile man she had been spoon-feeding for years. His lips pressed together, the muscles in his neck tightening. "I didn't mean for you to—" She gave a short, disbelieving breath that might have been a laugh if it hadn't tasted so bitter. "Didn't mean for me to see, or didn't mean for it to happen at all." Neither answer came. The silence stretched, only the faint hum from the heater filling the room. Clara's eyes moved between them, taking in the subtle flush on Iris's cheeks, the slight dampness on Silas's brow, the way they avoided looking at each other now, as though that might erase what she'd walked in on. Her pulse roared in her ears. Every muscle in her body seemed to have gone cold, except for the sharp heat that burned behind her eyes. She had imagined walking through this door 1,000 times over the years, always to find him resting, always to find him grateful she had returned. Never like this. Finally, Iris spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I should go." She moved toward the doorway, but Clara's gaze stayed locked on Silas. She didn't give Iris the grace of a nod or a word. The sound of footsteps retreating down the hall faded until only the two of them were left, the space between them wider than the room itself. Silas's eyes didn't leave hers, but the steadiness she had once known in that gaze was gone. "Clara," he said again, softer now, "I can explain." Her arms crossed over her chest, more to hold herself together than to block him. Explain why you're standing, looking healthy, after years of telling me you could barely lift your head. Explain why she's the one in here with you instead of me. He swallowed, the movement visible in his throat. I started to feel stronger a while back. I didn't tell you because I was afraid of what it would mean for us, for everything we've been living these past years. Her brow knit, confusion cutting through the disbelief. Afraid of what? That I might stop caring for you? That I might stop loving you? No. He stepped toward her, but she didn't move. Afraid that if I said I was better, things would go back to how they were before. The pressure, the distance between us that started before I got sick. With her, it felt different. The words landed like stones in her chest. Different? She repeated, each syllable colder than the last. He let out a slow breath. She listened when I needed to talk about things I didn't want to burden you with. One thing led to another. I didn't plan it. I swear. Clara's lips trembled, but her voice held. You didn't plan it, but you let it happen. While I was spoon-feeding you. While I was waking in the night to check your breathing. While I was telling our children their father just needed more time. His mouth opened, then closed again. The silence was heavier now. No hum of the heater could soften it. Her eyes swept over him one last time. The man she had loved with all her heart. The man she had built a family with. She felt the years of sacrifice pressing against her ribs, each memory sharp and clear, the nights alone, the mornings filled with quiet routines, the moments she whispered encouragement into the air, believing he couldn't hear. She didn't cry. Not yet. She simply turned her face toward the door, her voice low and steady. We'll talk later. Not now. Without waiting for a reply, she stepped into the hallway, leaving him in the stillness he had made. The distance between them was no longer just in the room. It was in everything. The house was quiet when Clara returned to their bedroom. The children had been tucked in hours ago, their breathing slow and even in the next room. That stillness was the only thing keeping her from raising her voice the moment she crossed the threshold. Silas sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He didn't look up until she closed the door behind her. Clara, he said, the word tentative, as if testing whether she would listen. She stayed standing. You've had time to think, so tell me, how long have you been able to walk like that? He exhaled slowly, hands clasping together. Months. I started getting stronger months ago. Her head tilted slightly, the disbelief sharpening her tone. And you decided not to tell me. I thought, if I told you, everything would change. We'd go back to the way it was before I got sick. We were already drifting then, and I didn't want to lose you completely. Her jaw tightened. So you kept me in the dark. You let me believe you couldn't stand, couldn't eat without my help. You let our children think their father was fighting for his life every day. He rubbed his palms together, as though trying to warm cold hands. I didn't mean to hurt you. Iris was here when you couldn't be, when you were taking care of the kids or the house. She listened. She asked about things I couldn't bring myself to tell you. Clara's voice dropped, low and cutting. And that made her your confidant, your comfort. He didn't deny it. Her chest rose and fell, her breath slow but heavy. Do you have any idea what these last 10 years have been for me? Every meal I prepared, every night I stayed awake to make sure you were still breathing. I was carrying both of us, and while I was carrying you, you were giving pieces of yourself to someone else. His gaze faltered. I didn't want to let go of her, he admitted, the words raw, as though confessing to himself as much as to her. A tight silence wrapped around the room. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock, a reminder that the children were asleep just beyond the wall. Clara's voice was steady, but her hands were clenched at her sides. You didn't want to let go of her, but you didn't think twice about letting go of me. Silas's eyes searched hers, as though hoping to find a trace of the woman who once believed in him without question. Clara, I never stopped loving you. Her laugh was short and hollow, nothing like the sound he used to draw from her. Love? You call this love? Love doesn't keep someone in the dark. It doesn't ask them to pour out every last drop of themselves while you keep secrets in the same house. I was scared, he said, leaning forward, his elbows digging into his knees. You were already doing so much for me. I didn't want to burden you with the truth, that I felt stronger but wasn't ready to face everything that came with it. Iris understood that. She made things feel lighter. The word lighter cut deeper than he seemed to realize. Clara's voice sharpened. So she gave you relief from your guilt. while I carried the weight of your recovery, alone." He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. For a moment the silence pressed in again. Clara's mind ran through every image of the past 10 years, the trays she'd balanced while rushing upstairs, the ache in her back from lifting him when he needed help, the way she'd forced a smile for the children so they wouldn't see her worry. All of it built on the belief that they were in this together. Now, that belief lay shattered. She stepped closer, her voice a low, deliberate thread of sound. "You took my devotion and hid behind it. You let me think you needed me in ways you didn't. And while I was giving everything I had, you were building something with her." Silas's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry." The words felt too small, like a single drop against years of drought. She shook her head slowly. "You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." His mouth opened to protest, but she lifted a hand, stopping him. "Don't. The children are asleep. I won't wake them for this." Her gaze lingered on him for one final moment, long enough for the truth to settle between them like a heavy stone neither could move. Then she turned toward the door, her steps measured, every muscle taut with restraint. At the threshold, she paused, not looking back. Whatever this marriage was, it's not that anymore. She left him sitting there, in a room that suddenly felt far too big for one person and far too small for both of them. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way they used to be. There was no warmth in the pauses, no comfort in the stillness. Clara kept her words measured around Silas, speaking only when necessary, her voice calm but distant. In the evenings, once the children were asleep, she no longer lingered in the bedroom. She would sit in the small study instead, the lamplight pooling across her lap as she wrote in an old notebook she'd found tucked away in a drawer. She wrote about the years she had given, about the promises she thought were unbreakable, about the way love had changed shape without her noticing. Forgiveness never crossed her mind in those early days. Not because she wanted revenge, but because some wounds needed time to stop bleeding before they could even begin to heal. She wasn't going to let bitterness consume her, but neither would she pretend nothing had happened. Her focus shifted to the two small faces who still looked at her with unshakable trust. She walked Daniel to school each morning, holding his hand while Elise skipped ahead, her laughter bright against the morning air. In the afternoons, she helped them with homework at the kitchen table, listening to their stories, asking questions, laughing when they made silly jokes. The more she poured herself into their routines, the clearer her own mind became. She began cooking not out of duty, but because she wanted to make the kitchen smell like home for them. She kept fresh flowers on the table, not in the bedroom, and found herself humming softly while she worked. Silas stayed mostly to himself. Some nights she heard him moving around. Other nights he sat in the living room long after the lights were out. They spoke about the children, about bills, about the house, but never about that day. One afternoon, as she stood watching Daniel and Elise chase each other in the yard, Clara felt a stillness inside her that wasn't emptiness but a kind of acceptance. She didn't need to decide the fate of their marriage immediately. What she needed was to protect her own peace and give her children stability. If you believe that self-respect is worth more than any riches, hit that like button and share this message. It was a few weeks later, before the sun had risen, when Clara woke with a quiet urge to leave the house. The children were still asleep, their small forms curled under their blankets. She slipped into the hallway, knocked lightly on each of their doors, and whispered, "Come with me." Daniel rubbed his eyes. Elise clutched her teddy, but they didn't question her. They dressed in warm sweaters, and together they stepped out into the early morning air. The world felt untouched at that hour, soft light stretching across the horizon, the faint cry of gulls overhead. Clara led them down the familiar path toward the shoreline, the crunch of sand and shells under their shoes breaking the silence. When they reached the water's edge, the tide was low, and the sky was slowly brightening. Daniel ran ahead, skipping stones, while Elise crouched to collect tiny seashells in her palm. Clara stood still, watching the thin line where the water met the sky. In that moment, she realized she was no longer standing in the shadow of what had happened. She was here, breathing the same salt air she'd breathed in happier times. But now it was her choice to be here, her choice to move forward. She crouched to help Elise arrange the shells in a small circle, the kind of simple act that felt like building something new, even if it was only for the morning tide to reclaim. Daniel's laughter reached her from a few yards away, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. Her life was no longer bound by the version of love she had once fought to protect. It would be shaped now by honesty, by care freely given and freely returned, and by the steady presence of the two souls who needed her most. As the first streaks of gold lit the water, Clara took each child's hand. Together, they walked along the shoreline, their footprints marking a path only they would remember. "Let's come back next week," Daniel said, glancing up at her. "We will," Clara replied, and she meant it, not as a promise to hold on to the past, but as a step into a life that was entirely hers to build. Subscribe to hear more stories that remind us of the power of truth, love, and new beginnings.